You know, every country's economy is built on some kind of big idea, a master plan. Today, we're going to dig into the powerful socialist blueprint that Israel's founders used to build its economy, right from scratch.
Okay, so let's just think about this for a second. Imagine you get to build a new country. A total blank slate. You've got to create an entire economy. What's your guiding philosophy? What's the big idea? Well, let's dive into the very specific answer that Israel's founders came up with.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the big economic ideas that were floating around at the time. Then we'll zoom in on the socialist path Israel took, see what that actually looked like in the early years, and wrap up by connecting it all to where the country's economy is today.
So, first things first, Israel's economy didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, from the moment the state was founded back in 1948, its economic path was very deliberately shaped by a really powerful guiding ideology.
And this is the key. The folks actually building the state, setting up all the institutions, they were from parties like Mapai and Mapam, the workers' parties. So for them, socialist beliefs, that wasn't just an option on the table. It was more like the default setting, the factory settings for the whole new nation's economy. To really get why they went this route, we kind of have to understand the three big economic isms that were competing on the world stage back then. You can think of them as three totally different operating systems for running a country.
Okay, so on one extreme, you've got communism. Just picture the Soviet Union. Here, the state is everything, and I mean everything. There's no private property, the government owns all the resources and is in charge of handing them out equally to everybody.
Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have pure capitalism. In this world, the free market is king. The government's role is hands-off. It's kind of a survival of the fittest model, with absolutely no state guarantee for things like welfare, housing, or a job. And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The huge difference really comes down to state control versus private ownership. On one side, the state owns and plans everything for the good of the group. On the other, it's all about private individuals driving the economy in a free market.
And then, wedged right in the middle, you have this third way, socialism. Think of it as a hybrid. You can still own private property, absolutely. But, and this is a big but, the state steps in a major way to make sure there's a strong social safety net. It's committed to ensuring everyone's basic needs are met.
You can see these different models playing out all over the world, right? The Soviet Union was the textbook example of communism. For socialism, you think of places like Sweden or France with their strong welfare states. And of course, the United States is the classic example of a capitalist, market-driven economy.
So, you have these three options on the table. Which way did Israel's founders go? Well, for them, it was a no-brainer.
See, for them, the main goal wasn't just about building up wealth. Their North Star, their entire vision, was to create a society based on as much equality as humanly possible. That was priority number one.
So where did this intense focus come from? Well, it was a mix of things. A big part was their own experience in the kibbutz movement. Then there was their political dominance as the workers' parties. They even drew some inspiration from Soviet social concepts, not the politics but the social ideas. At the end of the day, it all came together in this powerful desire to build a true welfare state.
And this is so important. They weren't just dreamers working from a textbook. They had a living, breathing laboratory for these socialist ideals right there, the kibbutz. It was a small-scale society where everyone pitched in, everyone worked, and everyone got what they needed. Shared food, shared housing, the whole deal. The big idea was, hey, what if we could scale this up for the whole country?
Okay, so what does it actually look like when you try to build an entire nation based on this socialist blueprint? Let's take a look at how they put these ideas to work during Israel's first couple of decades. This period, from 48 to 66, is known as the directed economy, and that name says it all, really. This was an economy that was actively steered and managed by the government, not just left to the whims of the market.
So how did this work in practice? Well, this whole system basically rested on four huge pillars. First, you had central planning. The government was calling the shots on where the money went. Second, massive state intervention in, well, pretty much everything. Third, most of the big companies were actually owned by the government. And fourth, and this is a really unique one, you had Histadrut. This was a labor union, but it was so powerful it was also a major employer, itself owning banks and factories, the whole shebang.
This table just makes it so incredibly clear. The state wasn't just a referee on the sidelines, it was the star player, on the field in every position. Building and handing out housing, that was the state. Running the major industries, state again. The number one employer in the country, you guessed it, the government was the absolute center of gravity for all economic activity.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. What's the lasting impact of this socialist foundation? How does it continue to shape Israel today?
Here's the bottom line. Those first 18 or so years weren't just some passing phase. They actually forged the country's economic DNA. This deep-rooted idea of state intervention and a strong social safety net got hardwired into the system, and it's influenced how the economy has developed ever since.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? This brings us to a huge question for today. How does that old legacy, that DNA of a state-managed economy, affect modern challenges? I'm talking about things like Israel's famously high cost of living. Is that deep-seated belief in state intervention a help, or is it a hindrance when you're competing in a 21st century global market? That's really the tension we're left with.
All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most incredible economic stories of the 20th century. We're talking about how the brand new state of Israel, against pretty much all odds, managed to even build an economy in its first few years of existence. So this really is the central question, isn't it? And this isn't just some thought experiment. This was the cold, hard reality facing Israel's leaders. Just try to imagine it, your country's population more than doubling in just a handful of years. How on earth do you feed everyone? Where do they live? What jobs do they do? I mean, it sounds completely impossible. Okay, so to understand how they even began to tackle this, you've got to look at the vision they had. See, the founders weren't just building a country, they were trying to build an entire economy from the ground up, and it was all based on a very specific set of ideals. And you can see here how it all kind of fits together. The ideology at the time was deeply socialist, and that meant the government was in the driver's seat for, well, pretty much everything. It was central planning, pure and simple. And what was their number one, top-of-the-list priority? Agriculture. They set up all these new settlements, you've probably heard of the kibbutzim, all with one single-minded goal: food security. The nation absolutely had to be able to feed itself. That was job one. But that idealistic vision was about to slam head-on into a monumental challenge. A literal human wave was heading for Israel's shores, and it was going to test this young state to its absolute breaking point. And to really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this challenge, you just have to look at the numbers. On one side, you have this tiny, brand new nation, and on the other, this absolutely unprecedented wave of immigration. The math is just staggering. So get this, in 1948, when Israel was founded, the entire population was only 600,000 people. That's it. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than a lot of cities are today. Then, boom, by 1955, just 7 years later, they had taken in nearly 1 million new immigrants. Let that sink in for a second. The population didn't just grow, it exploded. It more than doubled. And this wasn't some slow, gradual thing. This was an all-out emergency. Well, the result was completely inevitable, right? A critical shortage of, well, everything. Not enough houses, not enough jobs, and most importantly, not enough food. You just couldn't feed that many people. So what do? What does a government do when faced with a situation like that? Israel's answer was a really drastic policy. It was known as the Tzena, which translates to the austerity period. The whole idea behind Tzena was actually pretty simple. If there isn't enough to go around for everybody, then you have to control what everybody gets. It was a policy of radical rationing, and it was designed to make sure that every single family, whether they were new arrivals or had been there for a while, got an equal share, even if that share was, painfully small. And this quote right here just illustrates the logic perfectly. It's so simple and stark. You've only got 10 eggs, but 20 families. So what do? You ration. Everybody gets their share. This wasn't about getting rich or prosperity. It was about survival, and it was about fairness. The government basically decided, look, it's better for everyone to have a little than for some people to have a lot while others starve. And this wasn't some short-term fix they did for a few months. Official rationing kicked off in 1949 and didn't really fully end for almost a decade. For a whole generation of Israelis, this state of austerity, this was just normal life. It was their economic reality. So what did that actually look like day to day? Well, this policy touched literally every part of life. You got coupons for your food and other basic goods. The government controlled all the resources, and they slammed the brakes on imports. Now, part of that was to get local production going, but the biggest reason was to save every last bit of foreign currency for the most critical thing of all, national security. But here's the thing. even with all that rationing, it just wasn't enough. The country was teetering on the brink. They desperately needed cash, real capital, to build things like roads and factories and create jobs. A lifeline had to come from somewhere else. And that lifeline ended up coming from two main places. First, you had loans from the American Jewish community. This was the Israel Bonds Program, and it was an absolutely incredible source of money for development. The second source, though, was much, much more complicated. We're talking about reparations from West Germany for the Holocaust. Now, this decision to take money from Germany, you have to understand, this was one of the most painful, most divisive issues in Israel's early history. For so many people, especially Holocaust survivors, the idea of taking what they called blood money was just unthinkable. There were huge protests. It really threatened to tear the country apart. But the prime minister at the time, David Ben-Gurion, he took a very pragmatic, long-term view. He basically argued that this money was absolutely essential for the survival and the growth of the state, the very state that was now the home for the people who had suffered so much. It was a gut-wrenching, almost impossible choice, but he was convinced it was what they had to do to build a future. So when you look back, Israel's early years were just defined by these impossible choices, right? A constant tug of war between ideology and sheer necessity, between the past and the future. And it kind of leaves you with a question for today, doesn't it? What are the impossible decisions that are shaping Israel's economy right now? All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to talk about something pretty wild, one of the most dramatic economic turnarounds in modern history. We're looking at how Israel pulled itself back from the very brink of financial collapse to become the tech powerhouse we know today. Imagine this number, 450%. Now, back in the early 1980s, that wasn't some crazy stock market gain. No, that was Israel's annual inflation rate. It was a full-blown economic crisis, and it was spiraling completely out of control. So, what does that even mean? Life under hyperinflation? Well, it's a total nightmare. It means your life savings just gone. Poof! Vanishing before your very eyes as the price of bread and milk skyrockets every single day. The whole economy was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Something big had to be done. So you've got this economic monster on the loose. How in the world do you stop it? Well, in 1985, a national unity government led by Shimon Peres, along with key players like Finance Minister Itzhak Modai and the head of the central bank, Michael Bruno, basically said, okay, enough is enough. They knew it was time for drastic action. And their answer was the 1985 Economic Stabilization Plan. Now, this wasn't just some minor policy tweak. Oh no. This was a bold, all-out, three-pronged attack designed to go right for the throat of hyperinflation and tame that beast once and for all. So what did this attack actually look like? Well, it was a direct assault. First, they slammed the brakes on and froze all prices, everywhere. Then, they made some really deep cuts to the government's budget to cool the whole economy down. And, maybe most importantly, they shut off the money printers that were just pouring gasoline on the fire. And the results? Honestly, they were nothing short of an economic miracle. Just look at this. In a single year, inflation just plummeted from that insane 450% all the way down to a much more manageable 20%. I mean, that's a stunning, almost unbelievable success. Okay, so the big question is, why did this work when all the other attempts had failed? Well, the people behind the plan, they realized something absolutely crucial. You can't just treat one symptom. You have to treat all the problems together. It had to be a package deal. And this table really breaks down the genius of that package deal approach. They didn't just pick one thing. They went after all three root causes of the inflation at the exact same time. You had too much money chasing too few goods? Boom, budget cuts. Raw material costs going up? Freeze the prices. And the big one, everyone expecting prices to keep rising? They hit them with a decisive all-in plan that completely changed public belief. That, right there, was the secret sauce. And you know, this wasn't just a win for Israel. It became a global blueprint for how to fight hyperinflation. Professor Brunos, one of the architects of the plan, was suddenly getting calls from all over the world, even advising countries like Argentina on how to tackle their own crises. But here's the thing. Taming inflation, that was just Act 1. It was the critical first step that created the stability for something much, much bigger, a complete transformation of Israel's entire economic philosophy, from a closed-off system to an open one. So what does that look like? Well, for starters, the government started getting out of the way. They launched this huge wave of privatizations. We're talking massive state-owned companies, like the biggest banks, chemical companies, you name it, getting sold off to private owners.
And it wasn't just selling companies. At the same time, they started tearing down the economic walls that had kept the country isolated. They slashed tariffs, they signed these huge free trade agreements with the US and Europe, and just like that, Israel went from being a small, closed economy to a real player on the world stage.
So, okay, we're moving into the 1990s now. And this new, stable, open economy, it created the perfect conditions, like fertile ground for a brand new engine of growth to fire up. And that engine was, of course, high-tech. But here's what's so important to understand. Israel becoming a startup nation was no accident. It was this incredible convergence, a perfect storm, really. You had the stability from the '85 reforms, the internet was just starting to boom globally, you had this massive influx of skilled talent, and then some really smart government foresight. And when I say smart government foresight, I mean they even started acting like a venture capital firm. They created this fund called Yozma back in '94, and its whole job was to use public money to invest in promising new tech startups. I mean, think about that. For that time, that was a totally pioneering move, basically seeding a whole industry from scratch. But all the stability and investment in the world doesn't mean much without the right people. And maybe the most critical ingredient in this whole story was the human factor. In the 90s, over 1 million immigrants came pouring in from the former Soviet Union. And these weren't just new people looking for jobs. They were highly educated engineers, doctors, scientists. They were the brain power, the fuel for this brand new high-tech sector. But they also had a second, huge effect. They were new consumers. They needed houses, food, services, creating this massive boost in domestic demand that drove growth from the ground up. It was a 2-for-1 economic miracle. It's amazing, really. The impact of those tough decisions back in 1985 is still paying off. Those reforms built a financial system so strong, so resilient that when the 2008 global financial crisis hit and wrecked economies everywhere, Israel's banking sector basically just sailed right through it. So when you step back and look at the whole story, it's just extraordinary. From a 450% inflation nightmare to a global tech powerhouse, it's an incredible lesson in economic transformation. Which, of course, leaves us with one final big question to chew on. The 1985 plan fixed the past and built the present, but after decades of riding that high-tech wave, what's going to be Israel's next growth engine? Welcome! Today, we're diving into the modern Israeli economy. And let me tell you, it's a story of, well, explosive growth, some absolutely game-changing discoveries, and, of course, the kind of unique challenges that only come when you're really successful. So we're really digging into 2 big questions here. First, how on earth did Israel become the startup nation that everyone talks about? And maybe even more important, what's next? We're going to look at the growing pains, the future tests for an economy that has just changed so fast. We'll chart the whole course, right from the year 2000 up to today. All right, here's our game plan. First up, the 2000s, the totally chaotic birth of the tech boom. Then we'll jump to the 2010s, a decade of stabilization and a massive energy discovery. After that, we'll get into the tricky challenges of right now, the 2020s. And to wrap it all up, we'll take a peek at what the future might hold. Okay, let's start our story back in the 2000s. And I mean, this was a time of absolute frenzy. Seriously, if you sat in a cafe, all you would hear was people buzzing about startups, investments, the next big idea. The ambition was just off the charts, but so was the volatility. It was a wild ride. You know, every big movement needs that one spark, right? The thing that ignites it all. For Israel's tech scene, that spark was one single massive event. Just one sale from one company that showed an entire generation of entrepreneurs what was actually possible. It just completely lit up the entire country's imagination. And this is the number that did it. $400 million. Can you believe that? That was the price tag for Mirabilis, the company behind that old-school instant messenger ICQ. Back then, that figure was just mind-blowing. It sent this crystal-clear message, hey, you can build something right here in Israel and sell it for an absolute fortune. And just like that, everyone wanted to be the next Mirabilis. So you got to ask, how did this all come together? Well, it was like a perfect storm of different factors. You had foreign investment just pouring in. The government got smart and adopted what's called the Irish model, basically using big incentives to get giants like Intel to set up shop. The universities were churning out new ideas. But the real secret sauce, the thing that made Israel different, it was the spillover from its advanced military. So much of that groundbreaking tech and honestly the best talent, especially in stuff like cybersecurity, came straight out of the defense sector. But listen, it was not a straight lineup, not at all. This decade was a total roller coaster. The whole craze hit its peak in 2000, but then bam, the global .com bubble burst in 2002, and it felt like all the air just got sucked out of the room. The whole sector got hammered. And yet, amazingly, by 2004, it was already bouncing back and strong. It really proved how resilient this thing was. All right, so let's move into the 2010s. The story really starts to evolve here. This decade is really about two big things. First, learning from past mistakes to build some real financial stability. And second, a discovery that was, well, completely unexpected and would literally change the country's future.
Okay, this is actually a fascinating piece of the story. Think about it. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, right? Economies everywhere were just devastated. But Israel? It stayed remarkably stable. And you have to ask why. Well, it's because it had already been through its own terrible banking crisis, way back in 1983. The lessons they learned from that pain were brutal, but they led to super strict regulations and a really robust banking system. So decades later, that system was tough enough to handle the global shock. It's kind of like what the whole world had to learn the hard way in 2008, Israel had already learned back in '83. So just as the economy is proving how solid it is, something else is happening. Out at sea. You could call it a bonus prize. Prospectors hit the jackpot. They discovered these enormous natural gas fields. You might have heard of them, Tamar and Leviathan. And this was an absolute game changer. And what did that discovery lead to? A concept that for Israel was pretty much unthinkable before: energy independence. I mean, for the first time ever, the country had its own massive source of energy. This dramatically cut its reliance on foreign imports and gave it this huge economic and strategic advantage. It's hard to overstate how big a deal this was.
I love this quote because it just perfectly captures the whole gas deal story. See, the government set a fixed price for the gas, and at the time, a lot of critics were screaming, saying it was way too high. But then what happened? Global energy prices went through the roof, and Israel was locked into that original, now much lower price. It turned out to be an absolutely fantastic deal for the country, and it was almost completely by accident. And that brings us right up to today, the 2020s. And this is where the story really shifts, because all that incredible success from the last 20 years, it's created a whole new set of problems that are, in a lot of ways, way more complex to solve. So the decade kicks off with the massive global shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The government had to respond with these huge aid programs, which meant the national deficit went up. But through all that chaos, there was one sector that basically acted as the engine for the entire economy. Even with the global downturn, the high-tech sector stayed strong. And that's what allowed Israel's economy to bounce back way faster than a lot of other places. And just look at this. The role of high-tech in the economy is just immense. I mean, it's almost disproportionate. It's really become the undisputed heavyweight champion. But, when you have one champion that's that dominant, it's not always without some serious side effects. So yeah, the high-tech sector is driving this incredible growth, but that forces us to ask a really critical question. What's the social price for all this success? Because when you concentrate so much wealth in one place, it's bound to create some new, tricky challenges. And here they are, the three big ones. First, you've got these enormous wage gaps. It's creating what people call a two-tiered society. You've got those in high tech, and then you've got everyone else. Second, the infrastructure just can't keep up. The traffic congestion is just choking the country. I'm not kidding. A drive that should take 40 minutes can easily turn into 2.5 hours. It's strangling productivity. And finally, there's this growing awareness that all this growth has to be sustainable. People are focusing more on green tech and being environmentally responsible. Okay, so let's wrap this up by looking ahead. How is the economy adapting to a world that's becoming more digital, literally by the day? Well, for one thing, the pandemic hit the fast forward button on remote work, and that completely changed the labor market. So in response, there's this huge push to invest in upskilling the workforce for the jobs of tomorrow. We're talking a heavy focus on fields like AI and data science,
everything needed to make sure the country stays on that cutting edge.
And that leaves us with one final, and I think absolutely critical question. You've got the innovation, you've got the talent, you've got the money. It's all there. But can the country's physical infrastructure, we're talking roads, public transit, all of it, can it actually keep up with these soaring economic ambitions? That right there might be the biggest challenge for the years to come.
Most modern economies, right, they're the result of some careful top-down planning. But what if one was built, well, almost entirely by accident? Built not by a government with a grand plan, but by waves of ordinary people who showed up with little more than their skills and a will to survive. That is the incredible story we're diving into today.
So let's just start with the central puzzle here. Imagine you've got a piece of land and there are almost no natural resources. How in the world do you build a modern, thriving economy on it, pretty much from scratch? I mean, where would you even begin? Well, for the state of Israel, the blueprint wasn't designed in some boardroom. It literally washed ashore. It arrived in waves of people. And each wave brought a new, essential piece of the economic puzzle, building the nation layer by layer. Now, this whole process happened across 5 really distinct waves of immigration, known as Aliyah, and this was all before the state was even officially founded. Think of each one of these dates you see here as a new building block being added, each one bringing something vital that the previous one lacked. So let's start at the very beginning. Okay, it all begins right here with the first Aliyah from 1882 to 1903. Now, these folks, these were the true pioneers. They weren't just building a community, they were laying the absolute bedrock of an entire economy. 25,000 people. I know that might not sound like a huge number today, but you have to consider this. Back in 1882, the entire Jewish population of the land was only about 24,000. So this first wave, it effectively doubled the community, almost overnight. It was a massive demographic shock, to say the least. And what was their focus? Well, coming mostly from Eastern Europe, their goal was singular and super practical: agriculture. They weren't there to build factories or banks. They were there to work the land, driven by the most basic need of all: survival and self-sufficiency. They founded the very first agricultural colonies, places like Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov, which, by the way, are major cities today. And their logic, it just couldn't have been simpler. As this quote puts it, "If you arrive and there is nothing, you first want to produce your own food." It really doesn't get more fundamental than that, does it? They were building the very first economic layer, just the basic ability to feed themselves. All right, so the agricultural foundation was set, but of course, a society needs more than just food to survive. The next 2 waves brought the framework, adding both ideology and infrastructure. You could call them the ideologues and the builders. A really good way to think of these 2 waves is like they were installing the nation's operating system. First came the software. That was the second Aliyah, starting in 1904. They brought the socialist ideals from Eastern Europe and created the first kibbutzim, those collective farms. Then, after World War I, the third Aliyah showed up to build the hardware, the roads, the cities, and the first little industries needed for all that software to actually run. Now, the next wave, starting in 1924, this one represented a huge shift in thinking. These new arrivals, they weren't farmers, and they weren't socialist ideologues. They were urban entrepreneurs, and they came to build something totally new for the area: a middle class. I mean, the contrast in motivation was just stark. The early waves, they were driven by these grand ideals: Zionism, a connection to the land. This fourth wave, though, they were driven by a desire for, well, normalcy. They came from Poland and Romania with a pretty simple request: let us live. And for them, living meant opening a shop, running a small business, and building a normal urban life. And their impact was absolutely profound. They didn't head out to the farms. Nope. They went straight to the cities, especially a rapidly growing Tel Aviv. And by setting up thousands of small businesses, everything from cafes to little workshops, they created the backbone of an urban middle class, adding this whole new commercial layer to the economy. Okay, so at this point, the economy has farms, it has infrastructure, and it has a growing urban middle class. But one crucial piece was still missing: high-level expertise and capital. That final piece arrived with the fifth wave, starting in 1933. And believe me, it would change everything. 250,000 people. This wasn't a trickle, it was a flood. And it was driven by the terrifying rise of Nazism in Germany and Austria. People were fleeing for their very lives, and they brought their life savings, their work, and all their knowledge with them. Yeah, the profile of these immigrants was completely different from the waves that came before. They were overwhelmingly middle and upper middle class professionals, doctors, lawyers, bankers, industrialists. They didn't just bring their labor, they brought capital. And crucially, they brought the expertise needed to build a modern financial and industrial sector. They were laying the groundwork for the advanced economy of the future. And when you put it all together, you can really see how the entire structure was built. It starts with this huge agricultural base. Then, on top of that, you add the layers of ideology and infrastructure. Then you fill it out with an urban business core. And finally, you inject it with that high-level capital and expertise. See? Each wave added a piece the others just couldn't. So this table, this is basically the final blueprint. You can see the progression, step by step. Each wave had a very specific role to play, from laying that agricultural foundation all the way to injecting professional capital. It just goes to show how a really complex economy was assembled, piece by piece, not by some central plan, but by the right people showing up at the right time. Ultimately, this whole story is just a powerful case study in how economies actually get built. It proves that an economy is so much more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's people. And that leaves us with one final question to think about. How are the immigrants of today, with their own unique skills, capital, and ambitions, writing the economic blueprints of tomorrow all around the world?
So how does a brand new country, in just 3 years, absorb a wave of people nearly as large as its entire existing population? I mean, it sounds pretty much impossible, right? But it's a true story. And it points to a single, incredibly powerful tool for remaking a nation.
Okay, get this. Between 1948 and 1951, 700,000 immigrants arrived in the brand new state of Israel. That is just a staggering number. But to really, truly grasp the scale of this challenge, you have to see it in context.
The country's population almost doubled. In 3 years, just try to wrap your head around that for a second. For every person already living there, another person showed up. Imagine the unbelievable strain on everything: food, housing, jobs. The challenge was so massive, it actually led to a period of national austerity and rationing.
So that leads us to the central question we're tackling today. How do you possibly build a cohesive society from such a massive, sudden influx? Well, the answer is pretty fascinating, and we find it by looking at 3 totally different waves of immigration, each with its own unique story.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll really dig into the scale of that initial challenge, when the nation nearly doubled. Then we're going to look at that first great wave from the Middle East, and contrast it with the brain gain revolution from the Soviet Union. After that, we'll explore the incredible journey from farmland to mainframe with Ethiopian immigrants. And finally, we'll uncover the one powerful idea that ties them all together: the great equalizer.
All right, let's dive into our first case study. This one starts right at the beginning, in the earliest days of the state. It's all about that massive wave of immigration from North Africa and the Middle East, a wave that would really define the country's first huge test.
So this first wave of people came mostly from North Africa and the Middle East. Now, compared to the European population that was already there, many of them arrived with less formal education and from really different cultural backgrounds. The biggest, most immediate crisis was just housing. This led to these huge temporary transit camps called ma'abaraks. And this whole influx put an absolutely incredible burden on an economy that was already super fragile.
Okay, now let's jump forward about 40 years. The country's facing another wave of immigration, just as massive in scale as the first one. But this time, the challenge was completely different. The kind of people arriving worlds apart.
With the fall of the Iron Curtain, we're talking about nearly 1 million people arriving from the former Soviet Union all through the 1990s. That's an even bigger number than that first wave. But the crucial difference wasn't the number of people. It was what was in their heads. And when you put these 2 waves side by side, the difference is just night and day. While the first wave came with more traditional agricultural skills, this new wave was a brain gain of epic proportions. We're talking about people with incredibly high levels of education: engineers, doctors, scientists, technologists. So the challenge wasn't about teaching basic literacy. It was about how to integrate this huge pool of professional talent. You see, this wave wasn't just about finding room for more people. It was like a direct infusion of high-level knowledge, technology, and innovation. This incredible influx of expertise became
the seed money, really, for what would later be known as Silicon Wadi, and it completely reshaped the Israeli economy from the ground up.
And here's a perfect little story that shows you exactly what I mean. There's this successful Israeli high-tech company that makes advanced digital scales. Well, the whole thing was founded on an idea brought over by two immigrants from the former Soviet Union. It was their specific, specialized knowledge that became the bedrock of the entire company. And that story? It was repeated thousands and thousands of times.
But hold on, there's a third, equally important story here, and it adds a whole other layer of complexity. This one involves a community journeying from an ancient, rural way of life straight into a modern technological society. So, through two incredibly dramatic airlifts in the 80s and 90s, Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews were brought to Israel. But their background presented a completely different set of challenges for integration.
You have to understand, this community came from a society that was largely agricultural. They had limited exposure to modern things like financial systems or institutional education as we know it. So integrating them meant providing intensive support that went way beyond just language classes. It had to focus on fundamental skills for a modern world, like financial literacy. The gap to bridge here wasn't just about skills. It was about entire worlds colliding.
Okay, so let's just pause for a sec. We've got three totally distinct groups. One with limited formal schooling, one packed with elite technical skills, and a third from a rural agricultural background. What on earth could possibly unite these three different stories? The answer? Well, it leads us to one very powerful conclusion.
So what's the common thread here? How did one country manage to successfully absorb and empower people from such radically different starting points? What's the secret sauce? Well, the answer lies in one fundamental tool.
It's education. Simple as that. For every single one of these groups, no matter where they started from, education became the primary engine for closing social and economic gaps. It was the key that unlocked social mobility, not just for them, but for their kids and their kids' kids.
You heard that right. Education is the great equalizer. It is the one factor that can consistently level the playing field no matter where someone starts in life. It literally has the power to rewrite destinies.
And you can see this play out clear as day across the generations. While the first Ethiopian immigrants faced enormous hurdles, their children and grandchildren, empowered by the educational system, are now deeply integrated and succeeding across all parts of Israeli society. It's just proof of the long-term power of education to lift people up, to allow them to advance and to fuel success for generations to come.
You know what makes education so incredibly powerful today is just how accessible it is. Think about it. A few centuries ago, higher learning was something reserved for the wealthy elite. It was a tool used to maintain the social hierarchy. But today, knowledge is democratized. It's available to almost anyone, which makes it the ultimate tool for breaking down those very same hierarchies.
So at the end of the day, what we're looking at here isn't just some interesting history lesson. It's a universal blueprint. While the details are specific to one country, the lesson is clear for everyone. Investing in education is the most reliable way to close gaps, integrate newcomers, and build a stronger, more capable society for all.
And that leaves us all with one final and, I think, crucial question. If we all agree that knowledge is the key that unlocks opportunity, then we have to ask ourselves, in our own communities, in our own societies, who holds those keys? And what are we doing to make sure they're available to everyone?
Okay, so imagine this. Your country has a totally open-door immigration policy. Anyone who qualifies can just show up anytime in any number. You can't turn off the faucet. How on earth do you build a stable, prosperous society like that? Well, Israel faced this exact problem with its policy of Aliyah, the right of any Jewish person to immigrate. And its story gives us two radically different answers. One where the state provides everything, and another where the market gets to decide.
So here's what we're going to dive into. First, we'll look at the unique challenge Israel was facing. Then, we'll compare the two very different economic models it used to absorb these huge waves of new citizens. We'll check out the dramatic results, the good and the bad. And finally, we'll zoom in on the human cost and the big lessons learned along the way. All right, let's start at the very beginning. What makes emigration to Israel so different from almost anywhere else? Well, it all comes down to a really fundamental difference in philosophy.
And this slide really gets to the heart of it. See, most countries, they regulate immigration with quotas. It's like a faucet they can turn on or off depending on what the labor market needs. But Israel, it has an open door.
The law of return means the government simply can't control the flow of people, and that makes economic planning, as you can imagine, unbelievably difficult. So you've got this massive, totally unpredictable flood of people. What do? This threw down a huge economic and social challenge. The country couldn't just sit back and hope for the best. It had to come up with a real strategy. And that led to two completely different philosophies on how to integrate millions of new citizens. So let's rewind the clock to the 1950s and check out the first approach. Back then, the state, which had really strong socialist roots, took a very hands-on, very top-down role in everything. In the 50s, the government's playbook was pretty straightforward. It did everything. It provided housing, first in these stark temporary camps called mabarats, and later in whole development towns built out of nothing. It created jobs through massive public works projects, putting people to work building roads, planting forests, you name it. And it supplied families with the actual physical stuff they needed to start a life, right down to the food, the stoves, and the iron bed frames. Yeah, this quote just nails it, doesn't it? The state saw itself as the main engine of nation building. It wasn't just a safety net. The thinking was that the individual was part of this grand collective project, and it was the government's job to manage that whole project from the top. But, things change. That approach wasn't going to last forever. In 1977, a political earthquake hit, shattering that old way of thinking. A new, more liberal free market party came to power for the very first time. And that set the stage for a completely different model when the next huge wave of immigrants arrived from the collapsing Soviet Union. All right, let's fast forward to the 1990s. Nearly 1 million immigrants are pouring in from the former Soviet Union, and this time, the government rolls out a new, and I mean radically different, free market philosophy to handle it all. And you can really see the massive philosophical shift right here. Instead of providing a bed, the government gave you cash, this absorption basket, so you could go buy your own. You got to make your own choices. Instead of creating government jobs, it gave tax breaks to private companies to hire you, trusting the market to create work. And for housing, the government's job was basically just to bulldoze the bureaucracy so private developers could build faster. I mean, you can't get more different than that, right? This was a huge ideological switch. The government's role went from being the direct provider to being more of a market facilitator. The whole belief system shifted from collectivism to individualism, from state control to personal choice. Okay, so we've got these two totally different playbooks, but what actually happened? What did this all look like on the ground? Let's get into the economic ripple effect. Check this out. In the 1950s, with this huge influx of people, the economy just exploded. An average of 5% GDP growth every year? That was astonishing for a young, developing country. It dramatically raised the standard of living in just a decade, and it kind of proved that mass immigration could actually be a powerful engine for prosperity. But, and this is a big but, that growth wasn't painless. In both eras, when you flood the labor market with hundreds of thousands of new workers, you're gonna cause some short-term pain. Unemployment shot up, hitting 10% in the 50s and rising again in a big way in the 90s. It was the tough but temporary price of absorption. But it's so important to look beyond those big economic numbers, because we're talking about real people here. We need to zoom in on their deeply personal and often really difficult experiences. And trust me, this was anything but easy. This quote, man, it just says it all. So many of these immigrants were highly skilled professionals. We're talking doctors, engineers, scientists. They arrived with all this knowledge, all this human capital, but in a new country where they didn't speak the language and their degrees weren't recognized, it was all just erased overnight. So let's break down what they were up against. The language barrier was like hitting a brick wall. This led to de-skilling, which is a fancy way of saying they had to take whatever job they could get, usually manual labor, just to put food on the table. Plus, people coming from communist countries arrived with basically nothing. No assets, no savings. They were truly starting from absolute zero, all while feeling like a stranger in a new land. So what happened next is actually fascinating. To cope with all this and to hold on to their own rich culture, the immigrants from the former Soviet Union built their own vibrant society right inside of Israeli society. They launched Russian-language newspapers, radio stations, amazing theaters, even their own TV channel. They created a space where they could use their skills and keep their identity alive in this new world. All right, so after looking at these two totally clashing experiments trying to do the same massive job, what's the takeaway here? What did we learn from this incredible national experiment? This table really breaks it down for us side by side. The 1950s model was all about collective security and state control. It made sure everyone had a basic foundation, but it came at the cost of personal choice. Then the 1990s model prioritized individual freedom and market efficiency. It offered choice, but it also risked that some people might fall through the cracks. Both models managed to absorb millions, but in fundamentally different ways, with very different results for Israeli society. In the end, this whole story doesn't really give us one simple answer. Instead, it leaves us with this huge, provocative question that is so relevant for pretty much every country dealing with immigration today. What's the right balance? How much state support versus how much free market choice? What is the perfect recipe to help people not just survive, but truly thrive when they're starting over in a new country? The Israeli experience shows there are no easy answers, just a constant search for a better way. Hey, welcome. So today, we're really digging into a fascinating playbook for national transformation. We're going to explore how one country took a hard look at its most overlooked regions and strategically turned them into these vibrant centers of growth. And in the process, they unlocked the incredible potential of their people. So let's just start with the big question, right? How do you actually do it? How do you close that gap between a booming economic center and a periphery that's been kind of left behind? I mean, this is a challenge that countries all over the world are grappling with, but the playbook we're about to walk through has some seriously powerful insights. And this slide, well, it gives you a sense of the kind of transformation we're talking about. Just imagine a place like Kiryat Shmona, way up in the north of Israel. Back in the 70s and 80s, it felt a lot like that picture on the left. Isolated, not a lot going on. Today, it's a whole different story. But this change, it was no accident. It was the result of a long, deliberate process, a real story of trial, error, and a whole lot of learning. Yeah, this was not a quick fix. We are talking about a 40-year journey, a journey of strategic adaptation. The government realized that to really develop these regions and integrate huge new populations, they had to totally rethink their approach. And yeah, they made mistakes along the way, but the key is they learned from them and kept adjusting the course. This, right here, this was the pivotal shift. The old strategy of just, hoping for the best, that was thrown out. It was replaced by a really proactive one. The understanding became crystal clear. If you want to spark development, you can't just sit back and wait for the market to do it for you. The government has to step in and be the engine of that change. And through decades of this very hands-on approach, one single factor emerged as the most powerful tool for closing those socioeconomic gaps and really driving regional growth. This right here, this is the core thesis. The fundamental discovery was that the path to a stronger periphery, the path to real opportunity, was paved with education. It literally became the foundational principle for everything that came next. And this wasn't just some theory on a piece of paper. I mean, look at Tel Hai College up near Kiryat Shmona or Sapir College down south. These weren't just places for people to study. They became economic and cultural anchors. They created jobs, they attracted talent, and they totally changed the trajectory of their entire regions. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. With education as the foundation, the government then built out a whole toolkit of practical strategies to support it and really to accelerate development. So it was this really clear three-pronged approach. First, infrastructure. You build roads, you build trains to shrink the distance, not just physically, but psychologically, to the economic heart of the country. Second, as we've seen, you build those higher education institutions. And third, you have to be ready to intervene where the private market just falls short. It's a pretty comprehensive approach, and honestly, it's a model that policymakers who are wrestling with this stuff are still studying today. And of course, you had the financial levers. I mean, the government couldn't just build all this stuff and hope people would show up. They used targeted incentives, like really significant tax breaks, to act as a magnet, actively pulling businesses and talented people into these developing areas. It was like adding fuel to that fire of growth. Now, developing the regions, that was one massive challenge. But happening at the exact same time was another one. Figuring out how to successfully integrate huge waves of new immigrants, many of whom were highly skilled professionals. And the initial problem was immense. You had doctors, scientists, and engineers arriving, totally ready to contribute, but they were just hitting a brick wall of bureaucracy. They were facing these incredibly difficult certification exams in a language they didn't even master yet, which led to this tragic thing called brain waste, a massive loss of human potential. Now, what's so interesting here is the total shift in thinking this represents. That rigid, one-size-fits-all approach, it got thrown right out the window. Instead, they adopted this super flexible, pragmatic system. They started offering certification exams in Russian and Arabic, recognizing that, hey, language shouldn't be a barrier to proving you're a skilled doctor. They began proactively placing engineers in tech projects and creating programs to really foster entrepreneurship. And this is just a perfect example of that new hands-on approach. The government didn't just hope immigrant engineers would find their way. They created a dedicated high-tech incubator, gave them a budget that covered both a salary and their R&D costs, and basically said, we believe in your ideas, now go build them. I mean, this program became a launchpad for so many startups. So, here's the crucial point. Getting these incredibly skilled people into good jobs was a huge victory, but the strategy didn't stop there. True success, lasting success, required one more essential ingredient. They understood that for new arrivals to truly thrive and actually put down roots, they couldn't just be cogs in an economic machine. They needed to become part of the actual social fabric of the country. So how did they do that in practice? Well, the final piece of the puzzle was investing directly in the community. We're talking funding for community centers, using local schools as hubs for integration. The whole goal was to build a strong social foundation, with the understanding that those personal connections you make over coffee often become the professional and business networks that drive success for everybody. So this whole decades-long journey offers a really powerful model for development, one that's based on education, strategic intervention, and social integration. And it kind of leaves us with a final thought. As our own societies face new and different challenges, what can we learn from this playbook, and what is the next frontier in our own efforts to unlock human potential? Okay, so have you ever heard of an entire national economy just completely hitting a wall, on the verge of collapse, only to suddenly flip around like overnight? Well, today we're diving into exactly that story. It's a pretty stunning economic turnaround that happened under the most unbelievable circumstances. I mean, just look at this. It's night and day. Before 1967, you've got an economy in an absolute freefall. We're talking a severe recession, total economic paralysis. And then boom. Almost instantly, the whole picture flips. You get this explosive, unprecedented growth. The change is so dramatic, it almost doesn't seem real. And that, right there, is the big question. What on earth could be a powerful enough trigger to act like a switch? Flipping an entire economy from a dead stop to full throttle. All right, let's dig in and figure it out. Okay, so to really understand just how big this boom was, we first have to get a feel for the bust that came before it. So let's rewind a bit back to the mid-1960s. This was a time when this, just cloud of deep economic anxiety was hanging over everything. And listen, we're not talking about some minor dip here. In 65 and 66, Israel was in a severe recession. Economic activity didn't just slow down, it basically ground to a complete halt. It's like the entire country was just frozen in place. The Hebrew term for this is mitaun, which just means recession. But this wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. No, it was driven by something much more powerful, a collective emotion, fear. The whole nation was basically holding its breath, bracing for a potential war with Egypt. And that feeling of dread, it was powerful enough to paralyze the entire economy. And then, in the span of just 6 days, everything changed. This was the turning point, the fulcrum on which the entire economic story was about to pivot. I mean, this timeline really lays it all out, doesn't it? It's like a 3-act play. First, you've got the deep recession of the mid-60s. Then, the flashpoint, June 1967, the Six-Day War. And right after that, an economic boom. There's really no question about it. The war was the catalyst. So what did this incredible post-war boom actually look like? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was more like a domino effect, a whole bunch of interconnected factors that all came together to ignite the entire economy. Okay, so for starters, that massive psychological weight of an existential threat, it was suddenly lifted. And that created this huge wave of national confidence. That new confidence, well, it helped open the floodgates for tourism. At the very same time, the nation's borders expanded, which opened up entirely new areas for development. And to pour fuel on the fire, the government started making these massive investments in infrastructure, education, and health. But this was so much more than just growth for the sake of growth. What was really happening was that the very DNA of the Israeli economy was being rewritten. And this is where you can really see that fundamental change in action. Before 67, the public sector, the government, pretty much dominated the economy. But after the war, you see this massive surge in the private sector that completely flips the balance. This was a huge moment, a real shift away from a state-controlled model and towards a more market-driven economy. So you might be wondering, how did this shift actually happen? Well, the construction of the Bar-Lev line is a perfect case study. The government needed these huge fortifications built along the new frontier. But, and this is the key part, instead of using government agencies, they hired private companies for the job. And all of a sudden, these private contractors needed to buy trucks, tractors, all sorts of equipment. They had to hire tons of workers. So one single government project ended up kickstarting a whole ecosystem of private business. It created a powerful new engine for growth. And it didn't stop there. This new energy in the private sector also completely changed the kinds of industries that were powering the economy. It was, a shift from the farm to the factory, and eventually way beyond that. See, the pre-war economy was really all about traditional industries, things like agriculture. But after 67, all this new investment, all this new energy, it started getting channeled into more advanced sectors. We're talking about the very beginnings of an economy built on things like electronics and chemicals. And this wasn't just some abstract idea either. You could see it happening in real time with the creation and expansion of huge companies like the Dead Sea Works and Israel Chemicals. And the government was pushing for it too. They were actively encouraging this shift by passing laws to get people to invest privately in these new, more advanced fields. And here's what's so critical to understand. The high-tech powerhouse that we know today, that didn't exist back then. Not in its current form. But the infrastructure was being laid. The seeds were being planted. All the investment, the new economic structure, all of it was creating the foundation for what would, decades later, become known as the startup nation. And so that brings us to our final thought. The period after 1967 created this absolute tidal wave of growth that really defined the nation for decades. But it leaves us with a really important question to think about. How does an era of such rapid, such foundational change end up shaping the economic challenges and, of course, the opportunities for the next 50 years?
All right, today we're going to unpack a perfect storm of war, a global crisis, and some, pretty disastrous policy choices that sent an entire nation's economy into a total freefall. We're talking about a period that would go down in history as Israel's lost decade.
So, the lost decade. That's what economists call the period between 1973 and 1985 in Israel. It sounds dramatic, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, it was a time of just crushing economic stagnation, a crisis that really brought the country to its knees.
And to really get our heads around this crisis, we've got to go back to the beginning, to a single seismic event in October of 1973. This was the moment that first domino tipped over, and it set off a chain reaction that would go on for more than a decade.
We're talking about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. It was a complete surprise attack, and look, the military and political fallout was obviously huge, but the economic shock was just as immediate and just as devastating. The entire economy, boom, was instantly put on a war footing.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing inside the country. Just think about this for a second. Your defense spending goes through the roof, right? But at the very same time, your production, your trade, it all just grinds to a halt. So you've got way less money coming in, but these massive new bills for the war, what do? Well, the government really only had one choice. Go deep, deep into debt. And that's exactly what happened. The deficit and the national debt just exploded.
But here's the thing. This didn't just stay within Israel's borders. Oh no. This wasn't just a regional conflict. It sent a shockwave across the entire globe, kicking off a crisis that would hit pretty much every developed nation out there.
And you can see that global chain reaction play out right here. Basically, in retaliation for Western support of Israel, the OPEC cartel decided to use oil as a weapon. They slashed production and, get this, quadrupled prices almost overnight. And just like that, the first global energy crisis was ignited.
Now, this created a very specific kind of economic poison. It's called cost-push inflation. So what the heck is that? Well, it means the price of everything starts to go up. Not because people are buying more stuff, but because the basic ingredients of the economy, like oil, are suddenly way, way more expensive. For a country like Israel that has to import its energy, this was an absolutely crippling blow.
Okay, so let's recap. You've got massive war debts piling up at home and a huge global energy crisis hitting you from the outside. The big question is, how did the government respond? Well, this is where a really bad situation turned into an absolute catastrophe. The internal spiral was about to begin.
The government was really caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, you've got these insane defense bills and growing social expenses. On the other hand, the economy is shrinking. So, with not nearly enough money coming in to cover the costs, they turned to what is probably the most dangerous solution imaginable. They just started printing more money.
And this is where you see that domino effect in action. Look, printing money to pay your bills, it's not a solution. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. When you flood the economy with all this new cash, the value of that money just tanks. People aren't stupid. They realize their money is becoming worthless, so prices for everything have to shoot up to compensate. And that, my friends, is the textbook recipe for hyperinflation.
And let's be clear, this wasn't some abstract problem for economists to debate. No way. Hyperinflation had a devastating, real-world impact that tore at the very fabric of society. It hit everyday people, regular businesses. It changed everything.
And here is the absolutely mind-boggling result of that free fall. At its peak in the early 1980s, the annual inflation rate was over 400%. Just try to imagine that. The price of everything, your food, your gas, your rent, more than quadrupling every single year. That was the reality for people.
And this chart really shows you the sheer speed of this thing. It wasn't a gradual increase. It went exponential. You can see it going from something that was high, sure, but maybe manageable in the early 70s, to a completely out-of-control, hyperinflationary nightmare by the early 80s.
And this is the human cost, right? This is why it matters so much. The money in your paycheck was practically evaporating before you could even spend it. Your life savings, poof, it could become worthless overnight. If you owned a business, how could you possibly plan for the future? You couldn't even plan for next week. It just created this constant gnawing anxiety and a total loss of faith in the entire system.
And it wasn't just hitting individuals either. Entire sectors of the economy were just crushed. Take the kibbutz movement, for example. A lot of their financial model was built on taking out loans. So when hyperinflation hit and interest rates skyrocketed to try and fight it, that entire model just completely collapsed. It kicked off a massive debt crisis that crippled the whole movement.
So, after 12 years of war, global energy shocks, and these disastrous internal policies, the lost decade had pushed Israel's economy right to the edge. The country was literally staring into a complete economic abyss.
Which leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? A question Israel absolutely had to answer if it was going to survive. When your money is basically worthless and your national debt is massive, how do you save yourself? How do you pull an entire economy back from the brink? And maybe even more important, how do you restore people's faith? Well, that's a story for another time.